Welcome and good evening to everyone who's here. I'm Mahima Taneja. I lead research and MLE at the Gender and Digital Hub at Lead at Kriya University. And today I'm joined with my colleagues Deepthi and Vedhi in this work. And welcome to the Glocal Annual Evaluation Week. Now, most conversations this week are asking, how do we use AI in evaluations, or how do we make evaluations faster, smarter, more scalable? And while these are important questions, we are here to ask a different one today, which is, how do you evaluate AI and AI integrated solutions in the development sector? Who are these solutions working for? Who are they leaving out? And are we even measuring the right things? Because AI tools are being deployed across the Indian development sector today. There are chatbots for farmers, ASHA workers, algorithmic welfare targeting, AI-based health diagnostics, school assessments, and so on. But the evaluations of these tools are by and large focusing still on accuracy, engagement, consistency of outputs, etc. And these metrics, while they tell us whether the tool works, they don't tell us whether it works for everyone and who is falling behind. And when evaluations fall short, these flawed tools get scaled. And this is the stakes of the conversation today. Before we go any further, I want to introduce the 4 panelists who will make the conversation today very real and grounded in their experiences, because they're grappling with these questions, not just in theory, but actively on the field. First up is Urvashi Vatal, who leads evidence and impact at Khushi Baby, a digital health platform supporting community health workers across multiple Indian states. Before Khushi Baby, she was working as Associate Director of Policy at JPAL South Asia. Nilakshi Biswas heads the Translational Research Centre at NuSocia with expertise in evidence synthesis, theory of change, and public health policy. She previously contributed to impact evaluation research at 3IE and holds an MPH from George Washington University. Kalika Bali is a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research India, working on NLP, multilingual AI, gender intentional datasets for Indian languages, and advocates for culturally grounded and gender-aware AI. And finally, Arushi Gupta is a senior research manager at Digital Futures Lab, leading research on gender bias in Indian language LLMs in agriculture and healthcare. She has presented at AC Impact and sits at the specific intersection we most need today, that of AI safety research and development practice. We will kick off today's panel with a short presentation by GXT Hub before we come back to the discussion with the panelists themselves. Can we go to the next slide, please? Before we get into how do we even evaluate AI from a gender lens, it's important to foreground what is at risk. As is well known now, AI tools are not neutral. They reflect the biases of the data teams and assumptions that produce them. And here we want to touch upon 4 specific categories of risk that make gender intentional evaluation urgent and necessary. First is the risk of bias itself in training data, design, language. Second is risk of gendered harms. Think of deepfakes, welfare exclusion, biased credit algorithms, and these biases now are well documented. Third is the risk of epistemic harm, because AI optimizes for epistemic smoothness, which comes at the cost of friction and where women's realities, indigenous knowledges, and marginalized voices live. And finally, there is the risk of deepening gender digital divides. Our extensive research has shown that women's phone use continues to be episodic, supervised on shared or hand-me-down devices with limited data bandwidths. Digital trust is shaped by family permission structures and fear of online harms. And any AI solution that assumes individual uninterrupted device access is designed to fail for these women. With these risks in mind, what are we talking about? We're talking about a feminist evaluation or a gender transformative evaluation lens, because we cannot address these risks by better technical audits alone. Feminist evaluation exposes and critically examines gender and other sources of inequity by asking whose experiences are not reflected, It rejects evaluation as a neutral exercise and questions power imbalances and dynamics and asks whose definition of success is actually driving the evaluation. And when we apply this lens to AI, two specific things stand out. One is the importance of an intersectional lens. A feminist evaluation, can we go to the next slide? A feminist evaluation of AI will not treat women as one category and will look at the intersectional identities and axes of exclusion that sex disaggregated data cannot capture. And the second is the view from everywhere. Rather than seeking false objectivity, feminist evaluation values the clash of perspective as a resource. And that is exactly the opposite of what AI systems are currently designed to do. Now, when it comes to evaluating AI, there are a few emerging frameworks, and one of the more useful frameworks is by Agency for All, which maps AI across 4 stages, from model, product, user to impact. And while it looks comprehensive, in our understanding, it misses out on 4 critical things. One, of course, is a gender lens, and this is something we will discuss in more detail in subsequent slides. Second is measurement of unintended harms. Third, very importantly, is that this framework misses a systems lens because AI users are not isolated individuals. A banking Sakhi is one node in a NRLM chain, a member of a household, a person whose trust in technology is shaped by community. An evaluation that sees her only as an individual user misses this entire ecosystem. And finally, this framework doesn't reflect what we need today, a composite concurrent evaluation strategy where no single methodology can give us the full picture. I will now hand over to my colleague Deepthi, who will take us through what gendering each of these stages might look like and what kind of questions we should be asking at these stages before we open up the panel discussion. Deepthi, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mahima. So without wasting our time, I'll dive into it. So the very first stage being the model evaluation stage. And at this stage, the standard questions around AI are usually, is the AI accurate, or if it's consistent, reliable, right? These all questions are reasonable. But what it misses is there's a hidden assumption that accuracy is a neutral property and it's same for everyone. But that isn't the case. So when we ask who is missing from the training data, we find that Dalit, Adivasi, OBC women, and regional linguistic minorities are systematically underrepresented. It's not about if the data doesn't exist. It's just that because it isn't legible to dominate data collection practices. So as we all know, majorly all the data come from West. So therefore, Dalit Adivasis are underrepresented here. Therefore, models misinterpret local dialects and they erase indigenous expression as errors and default to male agronomic practices when the prompt doesn't specify otherwise. So here literature calls this as a framing trap, that is drawing the evaluation frame too narrowly. So here a gender intentional model evaluation also examine who built the model and under what conditions was it built and with what assumption was it baked in. A homogeneous development team cannot see what the model itself cannot see. Right. Moving forward to the next stage, which is product evaluation stage. So product evaluation usually asks whether the tool is being used as intended. But literature calls this here as a formalism trap. That is treating fairness as a design optimization problem, where while ignoring what the design assumes about who is missing it. So the default assumption may look like it's a solo user on a personal device, literate and digitally fluent. But we all know in rural India, none of these conditions reliably hold for women. Devices are shared, connectivity is unstable, and a woman asking questions about reproductive health on a shared phone may simply not ask them, right? And standard engagement matrices will record only that she didn't engage, and it will not record why she didn't engage to begin with. So the system lens add a product cannot be evaluated in isolation from its deployment ecosystem. And if an agricultural advisory is embedded in, let's say, a SHG structure, so does it reach all the members or just concentrate benefits at one node? So these are the questions one should ask here. Moving forward to the next stage, which is user evaluation stage. So usually user evaluation will focus on cognitive, behavioral, and affective outcomes. Literature quoting it as the ripple effect trap, it says that evaluating individual outcomes in isolation from social system the user is embedded in. But let's say take an example of a woman ASHA worker, and she's just not an individual user. She sits with a health delivery system, and she also sits in her household. She also sits with the community, and it has its own power dynamics. And two questions standard evaluation does not ask here: whose outcomes don't shift and why? And does this AI augment the user's knowledge, or it does, or simply displace or replace it? Right. So when a woman farmer trusts the app over expertise built over years of working her land, and the app is wrong, we should ask who is lost and who is gonna bear the cost. So literature quotes these examples as epistemic displacement, and therefore evaluation should treat it as one. Moving forward to the last stage, evaluation, this is where the development sector feels most confident, and we come, we can run RCT, quasi experiment, etc., etc. So I'm assuming most of us are evaluators, and we sit with our TOC result frameworks. But even before that, there is a step that is needs assessment, where we ask ourselves, do we even need this to begin with? And literature calls it tags it as like a solutionism trap. That is, impact evaluations are almost always commissioned after the deployment decision has already been made. Like when it reaches you, all these decisions were already being made, right? So structurally positioned to ask whether a technology works, and not whether it should have been deployed in the first place. Like, is it even the AI the right solution for that problem? uh, so yeah, beyond the idea is to go beyond solutionism here, and impact evaluation doesn't measure whether AI shifts a woman's decision making power, or whether benefits are appropriated within the households. It doesn't track whether women excluded from, let's say, adoption become more marginalized as as other women are adopting. So efficiency gains are not equivalent to livelihood improvements. And feminist methodologies like power mapping and most significant change, and methodologies like longitudinal inequality matrices should be added on. So they are how we avoid measuring aggregate performance while remaining blind to the particular harm. So yeah, at last, I would just like to say our proposed revision layers here a feminist and a systems lens across all four stages. But the deep argument remains around the is structural, that these are not sequential stages for separate teams. These four stages can't exist in vacuum, and it's not like impact evaluation or evaluators will come at the end. These are all interdependent, and they should be evaluated concurrently by interdisciplinary teams that include feminist evaluators, developers, researchers from the model stage onwards. So the question at every stage remains the same: who is absent, who is dropping off, and why. So, yeah, that's it from my side. Thank you so much. Back to Mahima.
Thank you so much, Deepthi. So this is the framework we are proposing. And now in the rest of the webinar, this is what we want to do. We want to hear from the practitioners at this table in this room about where this framework resonates, where it falls short, and what are we still missing. We will have 2 rounds of questions. In round one, we request each panelist to come in and reflect on this framework itself and their own experience, taking about 6 to 8 minutes. And in round two, we will move a little faster with 3 to 4 minutes per panelist so that we have space for audience questions at the end as well. With this, I first want to go to you, Urvashi. We are aware that Khushi Baby has been evaluating and looking at AI tools at 2 very different stages of maturity. The Asha Saheli chatbot, which is in field testing, phase and the anemia diagnostics tool, which is still at a model validation stage. Could you walk us through what evaluation has looked like at each stage? What is the difference between an expert technical evaluation and a community level user assessment? And what would a feminist evaluation lens mean for you?
Thanks, Mahima. And first of all, thank you so much for putting this panel together and inviting me along with all of the other brilliant women who are a part of this. To begin with, I think I want to give a little bit of context to what Khushi Baby does, because I think that speaks to how we've arrived at these solutions as well. We've been working for about 10 years now, designing technology solutions with ASHA workers, with frontline health workers, with the overall aim of helping improve health systems, making them capable of better decision making through the use of data. And this has largely been through a foundational data platform that we developed in Rajasthan first, called Community Health Integrated Platform, or CHIP for short. So this platform was designed with many hours spent on the field with ASHA workers, understanding their constraints, their burdens of data reporting, and also sort of how the hierarchy of community health workers flows from ASHAs to ANMs to CHOs and so on. And of course, over the last few years, as artificial intelligence has kind of, I think, shaped and reshaped a lot of our work, we also started thinking about how best can we leverage and when should we even leverage it, right? So I think right off the bat, the thing that resonated with me the most in what Deepti was saying was the point about actually thinking about, is there a problem to be solved with AI? And asking that question first before deciding this is a solution that we want to test and evaluate. I think that's like the first thing that we have looked at when looking at designing some of our AI solutions and evaluating them. But since the two solutions that you mentioned, I think for those, like you rightly pointed out, they are at two very different stages, and evaluation and the kind of questions we're asking look quite different. So the smartphone diagnostics tool for anemia, that is something which is currently at a nascent sort of technology development stage, at the validation stage, and it's the sort of core idea of the solution is that using images of the conjunctiva. A frontline worker can take these images, and then the machine learning algorithm can kind of predict whether the person whose image has been taken has moderate or severe anemia or not. So right now, we're actually in the process of collecting training data to be able to train this model, and then also then looking at eventually testing this in the field to see if it can actually improve our ability to screen people for anemia more efficiently. So the kinds of questions we're asking ourselves right now in the model validation evaluation stages, how accurate is this model? How does it perform compared to standard diagnostic practices? Is it actually, helping at least meet certain basic minimum safety standards and accuracy standards? And also, how does the performance hold across different types of populations, right? Because this is sort of the first anemia diagnostics tool that leverages AI that's being developed in the global south context, as far as we know. And so, of course, right? So there will be different kinds of populations that it is trying to sort of map. So largely at this stage, the evaluation is expert-led. We have clinicians, technical partners who are working on things like sensitivity, specificity of the model, its robustness, data quality. And one of the key questions we're trying to sort of answer at this stage is whether the data that we're training this on is representative enough for it to be expanded to further geographies. So right now for the anemia tool, the focus is on getting the model right. And once we have sufficient evidence on that, we would look at moving to the next stage of actually implementing it in a field setting. The other program that you talked about has moved further, which is the Asha Saheli. So Asha Saheli is essentially an LLM chatbot that's integrated into WhatsApp. It has a voice-enabled feature. It's also available in local vernacular languages where it's being implemented. And the whole idea is for it to be sort of a tool for ASHA workers to ask some basic questions about their work and activities. And where this sort of solution was developed was really based on our experience working with ASHA workers over the years, where we learned that essentially when an ASHA worker is doing home visits, she might have questions, or maybe the household asks her some questions that she doesn't immediately know the answer to. And if she reaches out to the ANM or the CHO to get that response, sometimes it takes hours up to an entire day. And that really makes them less confident and feel undermined in the situation that they're in, where they're supposed to provide counseling and households are supposed to trust them. So the whole idea behind Asha Saheli was whether we can give them a tool that they can use right there and then to be able to answer some questions. So the Asha bot is trained, and I should mention that it was developed in collaboration with Microsoft Research, actually, given that Kalika is also here from the same organization. So this tool was developed and trained based on their actual protocols and guidelines developed by the government, right? So it's sort of a limited training data that's being provided to the chatbot. And we initially piloted it with 20 ASHAs to kind of see. Actually, first we tested it with experts, clinicians, to make sure that the responses that we were getting were accurate from the bot. The next stage was to pilot with 20 ASHAs to see how the users are responding to it. And stage by stage, we sort of scaled it up now to 11,000 ASHAs in Rajasthan and Maharashtra. At this stage, our focus is on asking the next set of questions, right? Whether this tool actually helps the ASHAs do their job better. Does their knowledge improve? Do they actually even use it when they're out there in the field? Is it something that makes them feel more confident in terms of answering questions? And ultimately, one would want to look at whether there's a change in sort of the kind, quality, and quantity of services they're able to deliver. So I would say at both these stages, a feminist lens is very valuable in the kind of evaluation questions we're asking. When we're talking about the anemia diagnostics tool, right? If you look at the literature on anemia, there is a huge variation in the prevalence of anemia based on the kind of socioeconomic backgrounds populations come from. Tribal populations in India have a higher prevalence of sickle cell anemia than other groups. And so if you're working in those geographies, then that needs to be taken into account. So especially when we're thinking about the diversity of the population data that the model is being trained on, having a feminist lens, I think, is really critical to think about this from who we're representing in the data, in terms of socioeconomic actors, as well as whether they're from certain marginalized groups or not. Secondly, all our work, as you have, I'm sure, made it up by now, is working with women, right? Whether it is ASHA workers, whether it is with the communities also, where a lot of the health systems are serving women. So ensuring that there is representation in the data at all of these evaluation stages from the critical groups is something that we're looking at. Secondly, given that these are digital solutions, we're also trying to answer questions of who is actually able to use this technology, who does it work for, and who might be left out when you are pushing forward some of these technological solutions, right? So are some of the older ASHA workers who may not be as comfortable with mobile devices or digital tools, are they less likely to use it and therefore sort of getting left behind in this process? And what happens to the populations they're supposed to serve? How can we make these tools more relevant for the users where they are, right? So that is why this tool exists on WhatsApp, why we had a voice enablement feature, because those could be some of the tools that could help us get past some of these gender-related digital divides. And finally, I think when we're going into this next stage of sort of on-ground evaluation, there's interesting insights that are also emerging, right? We often think about digital literacy simply as, does somebody know how to use a smartphone or even a feature phone, or how comfortable they are using it. But what we learned when implementing Asha Saheli is that one of the big challenges Asha workers faced was even how to frame a prompt on the chatbot. Once we gave them a bit more guidance on how they could write these prompts, there was better responses from the bot and therefore more likelihood of ASHAs using it. But something which, when we are using ChatGPT, we might think of as like very obvious and straightforward, may not be the same for somebody who has a different level of education or a different sort of familiarity and comfort with similar tools. So that's another aspect of this lens that we're trying to incorporate into our work.
This is really amazing stuff, Urvashi, and really the question that you started with, that is there a problem to be solved? And linking it up with when your chatbot is, for example, now on the field, asking questions like, does it help them do their job better? And who is defining success there? I think are very important questions to ask for sure. And in health healthcare specifically, where accuracy is so critical and so important, getting the model evaluation right itself becomes so important. I actually now want to bring in Nilakshi, who has been the MLE partner for a large-scale AI innovation program, designing evaluations for AI solutions across health, education, justice, and agriculture. And Nilakshi, how has your experience been in evaluating different AI-powered solutions compared to how conventional evaluations run? Is there a framework you used, and did what we present resonate with how you have approached this, or is it different?
Yeah, I was actually going to quickly present a couple of things. I'm just going to dive straight into our learnings since we're all here for that. So just give me 1 second. Awesome. Okay. So as Mahima mentioned, my name is Nilakshi. I'm from NuSocia. We are an M&E and impact assessment partner. We essentially do social impact advisory, and we were the M&E partner for Pragati, which was led by the Nudge Foundation and supported by Meta. So it brought together 9 different organizations that spanned a whole bunch of different sectors, including ed tech, health tech, legal tech, and farmers, agri-tech, livelihoods. And I just want to quickly share a couple of quick pieces. So one of the key things was what we realized was that conventional M&E frameworks didn't quite apply. So we had come into Pragati with a standard evaluation architecture, but we had built an evaluation framework specifically for AI. Let me just quickly go over what it includes. So I have a quick image of what the parameters we drew were. One was, the organizational evaluation, which is the AI adoption and readiness of the organization itself. Then we looked at model evaluation, again, very similar to what everyone has presented, on looking at operational efficiency, the social impact metrics of that solution, and the scalability and sustainability. One piece that we included was the system and contextual evaluation. So this was looking at risks of the context, challenges of working within that particular system. And this could include policies of data privacy. It could include, different contextual or data infrastructure limitations within an area. And finally, we had one small portion of user centricity. Now, this was not a key focus, and I'll explain a little bit why. But this was looking at stakeholder satisfaction and feedback. And one of the key things that we developed for organizational evaluation was an AI maturity framework or scale. So you can find this on our website. This is something that helps organizations evaluate where they are in their AI journey. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's really important when we're trying to incorporate everything into our evaluation. So we built questions, on a loose theory of change and indicators for baseline, midline, endline. But then within the first few months, we realized the framework was really designed for a different sort of beast. The problem with AI-powered solutions is that the object of the solution or the objective of the solution keeps changing. So the model learns, the project pivots, new use cases come up as it starts to scale. So your user base shifts, and that means your context and your questions change. So for some organizations, we were applying certain metrics too early, and in some cases too late. Obviously, in the panel, we can get a little bit into which ones were which and why. We realized that quarterly reporting cycles, which we had initially come in to do, were completely mismatched to the developmental pace of certain sectors. So for the health tech sector, you have a lot of compliance issues and, for good reason. But because of that, they're not able to keep the same pace as certain other sectors. And there was a whole mismatch of metrics, right? We're trying to apply post-pilot metrics to something that's still developing. So similarly, when we're looking at startups that are in an iterative and development and piloting stage, the challenge was seeing what metrics to apply for them versus, ones that have already scaled to 9 states. So one size was definitely not fitting all 9 organizations. And the first thing that we learned was that out of all of this, a key piece was to tailor the evaluation framework to the AI solution maturity itself. So we had, by the end of the program, segregated the stages of maturity of the solution and then applied the necessary parameters. So it helped us realize a couple of other pieces while we were, doing this. One of the pieces was that there were 2 types of organizations. One that was an AI native organization. And what I mean by that is the entire organization was built for the solution. It's an AI-based company. It is an AI-based solution, and that is their only job. And they move very differently. They think very differently as compared to AI-layered organizations, which are organizations that have great buy-in into the community and the system. They know their user base. They know all the people, and they have interventions. Now they want to layer AI onto existing interventions. So defining what an AI solution was a difficult task, right? If you're layering one small piece of AI onto an existing intervention, does it really constitute an AI solution? So we tackled these questions through the evaluation and came up with a couple of answers. But I'll keep going on to a couple of other pieces. The other distinction that we really dug into was the difference between organizational AI readiness and the solution AI validity. So what I mean by that is the organizational AI readiness is their organizational capability. Do they have the capability of understanding the particular solution? Do they have the capability of scaling it versus the model like capability and validity itself, right? So the problem was that these 2 get conflated very easily, and it causes issues when we're trying to ask particular questions in terms of numbers and reach and all of those pieces. And another layer that comes into it is AI layered orgs usually then outsource their AI solutions and development. So the ownership and the development plan starts to shift. So even though they have great buy-in and understand their user, because it's outsourced, that connection doesn't really come to be. And finally, the third dimension or distinction was the user was not always the same as the beneficiary, right? I think we understand this when we're developing tools, but when we come in as evaluators, the person that's receiving the intervention, we expect that person to have an output or outcome impact. But a lot of the times, the intervention is going through a medium, be it an ASHA worker or a health worker or another person that is doing the teaching for an ed tech startup. So I think all of these particular distinctions and questions were really important when we were trying to figure out how we could better our evaluation work and our framework. So these are a couple of pieces, that I've already mentioned. Who is the beneficiary? What is the maturity level of the model organization, and who owns the particular bit? I also obviously have already been pretty transparent in what we got wrong. This is the first time we're running this. It's not like, we have everything down and we got it right. So I want to share the things that didn't work well so we can work up from that. So we struggled a lot with hard to reach beneficiaries and this issue of coming in when everything was already decided. So people have been already saying that, right? Is AI really necessary for this solution? Well, we came in when it was already decided that it was going ahead and this was the product. But a lot of the times we did ask that question, and this is a question that really comes in the ideation stage, right? Do you need AI or do you really need automation? And that was a key issue that evaluations face, because we talk about relevance, right? We have the OECD DAC framework, the RISI's framework, but relevance of need really seemed to be skipped because most organizations were given money to create AI solutions and build efficiency. So that was one of the pieces that kind of got skipped. Is this the correct problem to really focus on with AI? The other piece was when do we really come in as evaluators? That's one thing that I wanted to map out here for you guys. What happened is because we had to come in and people were at different stages, people were developing, people were piloting, people were scaling, and we were trying to have a whole list of metrics, right? We do a baseline, midline, end line. But we realized that depending on which stage they're at, we needed to change up what we were doing. So here we're just looking at, in the ideation, we're asking a similar question of what you have already proposed. Is AI necessary? Mm-hmm. Model and build. Who is actually developing the build? Whose data is it? How is it being labeled? Who is it leaving out, right? Is the pilot reaching the right people? And are you actually measuring for the user or are you measuring for the beneficiary? And finally, when you're looking at scale and impact, one of the key pieces that we were not able to look at is the quality of scale and impact. So with an AI solution, as it scales, quality is something that can deteriorate. And we were looking at reach, which is a classic evaluation indicator, but model quality was not something that automatically comes to be. So we didn't have the chance to really dig into that for this past year, but we do realize that is a really important aspect of it.
Thank you, Nilakshi. I think there are some very interesting. Okay, I was in the interest of time, sort of.
That was it. I was just leaving this up here. So the 3 things to leave everyone with, you've already heard it from me. It's just here for you to read.
No, thank you. And I think the big takeaways from what you shared was really looking at the organizational how the organization is using AI, whether it's AI native or AI layering, and the model maturity itself, and really thinking about evaluation from these 2 lenses is something that we need to build in whenever we are doing AI evaluations. You also spoke about the experience of doing model evaluations and what is the right time to do model evaluations. And on that point, I would actually like to now bring in Kalika. And Kalika, from your work on NLP, multilingual AI, gender audits, could you share a bit more around what does model evaluation look like in practice? How do you build meaningful benchmarks? Who needs to come together to build those benchmarks? What can they capture? What can they not? And what is the role different stakeholders play at the model evaluation stage?
Yeah, so actually, most model evaluations were done, are still being done on very standard benchmarks, right? And these benchmarks are usually when they were put together by technologists, period, right? And they are limited in their scope of what they are able to discover. There are some of them are extremely simplistic. Basically you have like these this data which you give to the model, and whatever the model outcomes, you kind of check it against what is right or wrong in that particular benchmark, right? Now, though, some benchmarks, there are humans, which I would say native. So I'm going to put a language thing on this because that's where most of my work is. So they are done by native speakers of a particular language for which the benchmark is being created. But honestly, a lot of these benchmarks are just translated, and that's where a big problem lies because, if unless you're doing 2 + 2 is equal to 4, or the capital of India is New Delhi, kind of really simplistic evaluations for the models, just translating doesn't make any sense whatsoever. I mean, it's like my pet peeve. Any chance I get, I will speak against translating model evaluation or any evaluation benchmarks because it just completely misses the point, right? So that's where that's how typically evaluation is done, and this is not just an AI thing, like what Nilakshi said, that you have to think differently for AI. This is the kind of history of evaluation of any kind of technology at a basic model level, not just AI models, right? And with AI, it becomes even more crucial not to follow that path. So some of the things that we have been engaged in is how to create benchmarks, taking the context, the socio-cultural context of the people who are using them, right? So that is where we get people who are working on in a particular domain, right? People who are actually deploying the system or building the application, their experiences of what we should be testing the model for, and actually the end users, kind of inputs into what they would like to ask the model, right? So that's the kind of major shift that has happened, at least in our work, that instead of like, you and me sitting and creating very quickly a benchmark and saying, okay, like, let's just test this and see what we get, right? Having said that, it isn't the case that there is no value at all in doing these simplistic benchmarking exercises as you're building the models, because it's kind of like a, milestone thing. If you're not even getting New Delhi as the capital of India right, then clearly there are bigger problems than, the kind of things that we are talking about, which are actually very complex problems. So I think that's where more shift has to happen. How do we include all the stakeholders and people who are not only like domain experts, but people who understand the culture in which the application is going to be used, the context in which the application is being used. And what happens when we talk about gender usually is that we all fall back on representation, and as if like everything begins and ends with gender representation. And to be honest, there is a history to it as well. Sorry, I'm probably showing my age here, but when the first speech recognition systems right in the beginning came into being, and that's where I started my journey looking into speech, they didn't work very well for women. They did not understand women. And I don't know, you might remember, maybe you were too young, but you also might remember when, you had these speech recognition systems on your OS, whatever OS you were using initially, it wouldn't understand Indian English or Indian accents, etc. And that definitely is a representation problem. If the data doesn't have enough speech from women to train the system, obviously it's not going to work for that. So that at that basic level, of course, representation is hugely important. But now what happens is that when we're talking about gender and its intersectionality with a whole lot of other things, then how much data, where is this data available? What are we going to, how are we going to even procure this data? If we are going to go ahead and design some data activities to get that data, then how are we going to ensure that we have this diversity covered, right? I mean, we talk about so much about Indian language capabilities of AI models and how we're doing great and continue to make progress. But if you look at it, we have maybe 10 or 12 languages. Like, it's not even all the 22 languages that we are adequately performing on, any of the AI models that you take your pick kind of a thing. So representation can solve the problem to a certain extent, but after that, it has to go beyond the model. Right? It has to be how you design the system, how you design the intervention, what your guardrails are, how you deploy the application, where you deploy the application. So I think this whole framework that you've presented, where everything has to kind of like all these moving parts have to work together, it really does resonate with me. And with gender, again, so most gender related work that I've done is like on gender bias, right? And here the problem is that bias is a very, very, there is no like a hard truth about bias, like this is biased and this is not biased. It depends on the social context. It depends on the the socioeconomic structure. It depends on the power dynamics, right? What I think of as gender bias, working in Bangalore, living in Bangalore, working in this like high-tech environment, etc. And there is bias there as well, is very different from like somebody, just on the street in Bangalore, or somebody living in like a village outside of Bangalore, right? The understanding of bias is extremely nuanced. And I think the problem with AI evaluations is how to capture that nuance effectively, right? We can kind of keep talking about all kinds of interventions and evaluation methodologies, but the crux of the thing is that this nuance and this diversity, how can we even capture it with a single evaluation methodology, which we can't? So we have to cut the pie in different ways, right? We get this particular outcome from this particular kind of evaluation. We get another thing. So, if I'm going to take an application out in the field for women in Chhattisgarh, right? Then the evaluation methodology to see whether that application works for those women, of course, the domain and everything matters, has to be very different from the evaluation methodology for a woman in Himachal, right? And here the problem becomes that the minute something is not generalizable, we talk about population scale, and my, whole beef with population scale is that populations are not homogeneous. So the minute you talk about population scale, you actually, what most people mean is like just one thing fits all. But populations are not homogeneous. And it requires more considered effort. It requires resources. And that's where most things fall apart. Even if you find a group of people who are willing to put in the effort and willing to think through this, who's going to fund them? Where are the resources going to come from, etc.? And that's where it kind of starts failing. So that's where I think a lot more work needs to be done. So the other thing is that in the current phase of AI, a lot of work is being done through LLMs as judges, right? So we can't find the humans. Humans are hard to reach. So let's like just train some LLMs on whatever data we have and use LLMs as judges. Now that is at best a kind of a stand-in, right? And my colleague Sunaina, who's been, Dr. Sunaina Sitaram, who's been leading all this effort that we've been doing around evaluation, and especially Samiksha, where we are trying to get communities involved in the evaluation process, has, we just published, put out some work in which she very clearly shows that LLMs as judges, when they kind of agree with each other and agree with the humans, is in the space where it's absolutely like factual kind of queries. The minute things become more multidimensional, much more socio-culturally complex, or where there is no one right truth, right? The LLMs might agree with each other, but they do not agree with the humans that much anymore. And the humans amongst themselves don't agree with each other. But that doesn't mean that you just throw that out, right? That just means that this is extremely nuanced, extremely complex, and you have to deal it as a complex thing and not try to put a single number or double-digit metric on it and say, done, right? And this becomes even, I mean, when you, anything that you put like a gender lens on requires you to understand. You can do gender evaluations, and most of the things when people talk about gender bias, they talk about things like, the doctor is a male and the nurse is a female kind of a thing. So we have to get beyond that. We also have to understand the intricacies of the language. Now, if a language like Hindi, a doctor has to be assigned a gender. The doctor has to be either a male or a female, right? And if the data available to the thing always has doctor as a male, it's going to output doctor as a male. Now, do you then say that it has to output doctor as a female? Is that kind of creating some kind of an equity? It isn't, right? Then do you come up with some random thing that 30% of the time it will say doctor is a male and 70, you see how difficult it gets because you do not understand the mere fact that Hindi requires a gender to be assigned. And it can only be one of the two genders. So going from like the intricacies of the languages to the fact that, most of us live in a patriarchal kind of a society where the power dynamics decide how women view bias, how women express bias, how women cope with bias, how women, you talked about access, what kind of access they have to technology to be able to even do that. And having said that, this work that we did, Sanmati, a while ago, where we kind of talked about, we talked to women and we discovered that women have, for the men, it was very simple. Are you going to pay me for some mobile-based task? Are you going to pay me? And if you're going to pay me, how much? That's it. For the women, it was like, will my family agree to this? Will my society agree to my doing this work? Will I have the time and the space to do this work? Right? It's always a secondary thing to my family responsibilities, right? And it became a lot more complex, a decision for a woman than for a man. And that's reflected in the data, that's reflected in the impact it has. And having said that, most of the women wanted to do that after having tried out everything. They want that thing because it gives them a kind of agency. And that kind of, evaluation does not come from running benchmarks on models or kind of putting numbers everywhere. You have to get down there, talk to the women, understand better, and their whole situation, the context in which they are, to understand that it actually does have an impact. How do you put a quantitative number on the agency that a woman feels, like, oh, I did this, I got this, it makes me feel empowered. Right? So I think evaluation is a very messy thing. Model testing or evaluation is a very, very limited slice of things. It gets us this far and no more. It is essential. But if you're really interested in the impact AI is having on society, there are a whole lot of things that you have to consider.
Thank you for sharing that, Kalika. But, yes, you say that model evaluation is one part of an AI tool and deployment cycle. What I was also taking away from what you were sharing was how bias will keep coming up in different contexts, even after a model, say, is stable according to, say, the tech team. as it will encounter new contexts and new populations and new people, it will encounter new biases by encountering new dialects, new languages, new population groups, new cultural contexts, and so on. And so, which makes me think then, does model evaluation really stop at some point, or maybe just the metrics on which we're doing the model evaluation, they shift from looking, right, exactly, from looking only at accuracy, we move on to look at bias and relevance more and more as the model gets deployed. Actually, now I would like to bring in Arushi on that note. And Arushi, you have worked extensively as an AI safety researcher and looked at bias inside LLM models themselves, so directly linked to what we are already discussing. How has your experience been in doing this research, looking at gender at a model stage, and does building a rubric help? And at what stage and what kind of rubric is helpful in your experience?
Yeah, thanks, Mahima. Just a disclaimer that there's very little I have to add after Kalika's, Urushi's, and Nilakshi's points, so I'll try my best to add more to the conversation, but all the major headlines have really been covered. So just to give you a quick background, back in 2023, we started looking at this question of gender biases in Indian language LLMs. And of course, the first step was to really look at existing scholarship and body of work on gender bias and LLMs. And we realized that most of the flagship works were really around looking at patterns and associations between certain types of occupational terms and female male pronouns. A lot of the work is really around doctor, nurse, exactly the kind of sort of narrow framing that Kalika talked about, right? And as women living in India, the instinct is that, okay, this is not enough. We need a much broader perspective on what gender bias really looks like, because we have a more nefarious form of patriarchal norms around us that don't get captured with those doctor nurse kind of testing prompts, right? So what we attempted to do is really unpack gender bias across many different domains, but the main cross-cutting theme that we advocated for is to look at gender bias in the context of the socio-cultural setting in which the model was being deployed, right? And this certainly does not mean that model level evaluations are not of value. Of course, there is a very baseline kind of an evaluation that we need to do in terms of what the base model has learned from its data, in terms of associations, in terms of stereotypes, in terms of its propensity to create denigrated portrayals of women. But at the end of the day, it's not the base model that the end user is encountering. The end user is going to encounter a finished product, a product that will behave once it interacts with diverse settings, and that kind of harms or gender bias would take very different forms, very different kinds of sort of characteristics to it, right? And at that time we realized that this evaluation rubric and the question around standardization is very difficult, right? Gender bias looks, maybe there are certain forms of gender bias that are objective in nature. So for example, there would be universal agreement around the wage gap, that yes, it is a form of gender bias, wage gap between men and women. But when we talk about, let's say, norms around clothing or norms around food habits, norms around mobility, they would really differ from a cityscape to a village level setting, right? So it's very difficult to have a single sort of standardized evaluation framework. And also, this prompts us to take a closer look at existing evaluation rubrics and whose values are they encoding. Are they primarily encoding the values of liberal city-based women, or are they really taking into account the lived experiences of women in diverse settings, be it from different religious backgrounds, be it from very different socioeconomic settings, right? And one of the I think we've sort of sufficiently also problematized this entire aspect around standardization, but I also want to come in terms of what does the right level of standardization then look like, right? Because we do need a common vocabulary, a common set of terms that would also make comparisons across models and across different types of AI systems easier. And maybe the answer lies not in terms of having the same kind of indicators, but really aligning on the kind of values that we want in our evaluation rubric, right? Now, some of the values, for example, and there's recent research in terms of the subtle forms of gender bias, right? So you look at how the model behaves when it responds to a male versus a female versus a non-binary user, not in terms of regressive content, but really in terms of its tonality, in terms of the contextual relevance of its outputs, the kind of agency it assumes the user has when it talks to a female persona versus a male persona, right? Is it assuming that it's easy for a woman to make decisions around her own healthcare and reproductive health? Is it assuming that a female farmer in India has her name on land entitlements, right? And that is exactly what formal training data sets miss out on. Those kind of documented knowledge does not exist. That kind of tacit knowledge sits with grassroots level organizations, with civil society organizations, which is why it's so important to involve them. But formal data sets really don't give us the kind of nuance we want models to learn from, right? Which is why then potentially once we start articulating what those common set of values are, be it in terms of looking at recognition, agency, actionability, contextual relevance, once we have those set of parameters defined, the next set or the guidance that we need to give to developers and evaluators is how to localize these into indicators for their own sector, for their own deployment context, for the community that they're really dealing with, right? In healthcare, safety and agency would look very different from what it would look like for an agricultural AI system or a welfare system, or even in fact for an edtech chatbot. It would differ not just between men and women, but really different intersecting identities within it, right? Which I think Deepthi and all the other panelists also quite nicely covered. So let me pause here.
Thank you, Arushi. And I think what you talked about, that whose values does a rubric or a set of metrics reflect, is very important. And which is also where we are positioning this argument for a feminist and systems aware lens to AI evaluations. That what values do you center will determine what questions do you ask, who do you ask those questions of, and how do you answer those questions. Which also connects to the point around both you and Kalika made about agency. How does that get measured, and how difficult it is to quantify? And there's enough that exists in evaluation literature today to tell us what are the different ways in which we can meaningfully capture agency, and that we have to go beyond the traditional evaluation, number-based evaluation there. Okay, so a quick time check. We are at 6:34. Maybe we can do one quick round of another question answer with the panelists. But if anyone has questions for the panelists, please put them in the Q&A. We will take them in the last 10-15 minutes. Please please mention who would you like the question to be directed towards. There is one already, but please put in questions while we do the next round of Q&A. For this round, I would request all of us if we can keep the answers briefer. But just picking up some of the threads that have come in, and I also didn't want to interrupt anyone in the first round because we're just sitting on such rich insights that we do need to discuss them. I want to go back to, at this point, Nilakshi and Urvashi, because both of you are looking at AI solutions at the deployment stage, or looking at some AI solutions which are at a deployment stage. And what we've also heard from in this panel from all of you is how AI tool keeps evolving and it will keep seeing new challenges. And the good thing about an AI tool is that it will solve for those challenges. It will learn and it will evolve as it will learn. Maybe it will shift who it is directed at. Now, if an AI tool is continuously evolving, how do we measure outcomes and at what level? And something that you said, Nilakshi, that do we measure it at the intermediary level? And that is the common mechanism of AI deployment in India, where there's an ag extension worker, there's an ASHA worker, there's a banking Sakhi who is often the intermediary holding the AI advisory tool, perhaps. And then there's the end user or the community or the quote unquote beneficiary here. So how, as evaluators, do we design, and conventional evaluators, do we design for this? When do we come in, and how do we measure community level outcomes? Either of you in any order can come in on that.
Sure, I can try to kind of go quickly and keep my answer brief. So I think as somebody who's worked in evaluation for most of my career and now coming into a tech space, I feel like the sooner you bring in an external evaluator, the better. Even if you're not starting the evaluation today, because there is a lot that happens. I think like Nilakshi was pointing out in terms of thinking of, is this the right solution? Does the solution need to change? It happens in that initial stage that can benefit from an evaluator. Having said that, I think where external evaluators are the most powerful, especially in the kind of work that we do, is in answering those questions of what is the last mile impact, and that's both on the users as well as on the final community you're trying to serve, right? Those are the kinds of questions that governments, funders are especially looking for in terms of like, what's the lasting change this is going to leave on health systems? What is this going to look like at scale? Like, are you actually sort of solving the problem that many of the organizations like Khushi Baby are trying to solve? So I think that's sort of where I see external evaluators being most powerful. Having said that, there are all these other kinds of questions we're asking at initial stages where still there is room for this kind of collaboration to happen. But like you said, right, I think there's certain ways in which the traditional evaluation methods need to change when we're talking about evaluating AI solutions. The typical kind of 2 to 3 year evaluation and outcomes will not work here because the solution itself is so rapidly changing based on what some of the tools are learning, right? So what then becomes really critical is to think about what are the early signals that evaluations can give decision makers, practitioners, to tell them whether we're on the right track or not. And how can we make evaluation methodologies more adaptive? So as you're learning, maybe the product changes and you sort of, test out new features. What I'm sort of trying to hint at is like a version of A/B testing, but that's also, looking at like social impact as the main outcome and not just like product usage. So I think that's the kind of direction sort of traditional impact evaluations might need to shift to be able to be relevant to testing AI solutions.
I mean, I think there's a lot to just say yes to from that answer. It's like yes to most of that. So yeah, coming in as early as possible, just because to understand the objective, I think setting the success matrix at the beginning is what was the most important for us. So the reason I say that is because when we look at a digital solution, for the most part, we're looking at efficiency gains, cost gains, the usual. But that's not how it always works in the social development setting, right? So there was a particular solution that was giving access for physically disabled children to the internet. So it was really just about access without getting too much into the detail of what the intervention was. So when we're looking at metrics, we're not looking at efficiency. We're not looking at how fast they're going to be learning. It's just, are they able to learn or not? It doesn't matter if they take an hour just to do that, right? So the founder, looking at our matrix that we had designed for 9 organizations to start, right, as a base, didn't work. And you have to change according to what exactly is the objective. And I believe that question is really good for people who are developing the tool itself, right? What is the objective for the user and what is the objective for the beneficiary, and how do you define success? Those are the pieces that the evaluator really prompts. And I feel like when people are developing it, they forget to ask questions. So yeah.
Yeah, and really, who is defining that success metric is again a value-based decision. And I think what I'm also hearing is that evaluators need to increasingly become partners of these institutes and, often in traditional evaluations, it would be seen as an external objective exercise, how evaluation is defined, judging the worth of something against some criteria. I think we, as evaluators, we need to throw that out of the window and define that criteria together with the organizations we are working with, and be partners in that journey more and more. I want to go back to Kalika and Arushi as well now. And both of you talked about rubrics and creating benchmarks with socio-cultural context. And I had two sort of follow-up questions there for you. One was, is it challenging to create benchmarks which are attuned to the local context, different dialects, different gender contexts, different cultural contexts, and what have those challenges been, and what is the workaround for that? So maybe I'll first ask that question and see if I have time for another.
Yes, it's extremely challenging because the people who have probably have the knowledge to give that kind of input are not people who kind of understand evaluation methodologies, right? So to give an example, we've been working on some safety data set, benchmarking data set, and for which we obviously need the term safety is like very loosely defined, but we obviously need cultural context in it. Now, the people who are available for annotating that data set do not understand the culture, the context, what needs to be annotated, how it needs to be annotated, what exactly are we asking, right? So there is a big gap between people who actually understand how the models work, people who have the socio-cultural knowledge, and people who are actually sitting and doing the data creation work. So it's a huge challenge. I mean, we're still working. Ask me in a year and I'll tell you how we worked around it. But usually it was like, you really have to have a very intense interaction between all these people to come up with something.
Arushi, would you like to add something on this? Yeah.
I can also quickly add that there are also some inherent limitations to benchmarking as a methodology to both evaluate as well as improve model performance. I mean, benchmarks are, of course, gameable. That's a problem that we're all aware of. But at the end of the day, they're very static test training prompts, right? They can't really capture socio-cultural nuance. Neither can they really capture harms that might have a more longitudinal arc, right? Not every harm is going to manifest at a single point in time in a single sort of model output. They might manifest over repeated interactions. So it's worth acknowledging that there are certain types of biases and harms that I can evaluate and mitigate through benchmarks, but there's a whole sort of can of worms that benchmarks do not really capture, no matter how many domain experts, language experts are really trying to solve that problem, which is why a lot of the focus is, even from our side, is to really look at shifting the paradigm of evaluation itself, right? What are some of the new ways of learning about model behavior and improving it that are not reliant on benchmarks, which are also privileging certain kinds of languages, right? We simply, for a lot of languages, we don't even have enough data sets to build the benchmarks. So benchmarks are not really the way to go and everything on which us as evaluators need to pin our hopes on.
Can I also just add one point about benchmarks? Is that benchmarks, if they're public, the minute they are put out, they're useless because you can only benchmark once, and then the model knows. So the benchmark gets contaminated, and you cannot. So you have to have like some continual updation of the benchmarks, or they have to be with a credible authority that does the benchmarking and keeps them private. So that's another issue with benchmark.
Which is why ChatGPT now says she's a doctor, he's a nurse, because they know the benchmarks are testing on exactly that.
Yeah, all my AI models have learned pretty fast what language to use when they're interacting with me, for example. And And okay, and then this brings me to my last question before we open it up for the audience. Evaluating AI-based, AI-powered solutions, and I'm looking at both evaluating AI models and then AI-powered development solutions, is a behemoth task. We do not even have right now any publicly available evaluations done on the end user outcomes. We have some indicative directional sort of literature that is coming up on whether it's actually moving developmental outcomes at the last mile or not, but still it's very scant. And it requires a lot more research, evaluation. We need new methodologies, concurrent approaches, evolving benchmarks, and so on and so forth. And a critical question that, however, stays with me is that in this enthusiasm for AI, is there appetite and funding available for this depth of evaluation and research that is needed? And if not, what can we as evaluators perhaps do and push for? So if anyone would like to answer or not answer this.
I mean, I would say like for people, as we sort of representing some of the practitioners, there's definitely appetite. I think we are very concerned about sort of not moving ahead with, ideas and solutions just because we think that they will work. We want to test them. I think funding is a different question. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm in terms of funding solutions, but funding the research on safety and impact and user feedback, I think we could do a lot with a lot more of that to be, have some sort of, I think, healthy skepticism also when it comes to AI solutions.
I think one comment that I have on funding is that what I've noticed whenever we've been kind of thrown into evaluating an AI solution, funders are they treat AI solutions like how you would in a commercial market. What is the return? And that's really the baseline. Whereas if you're looking at social programs, people usually tend to ask the why, what's happening, what's the little pieces on the ground. So I think changing that a little bit may be necessary because there has been such a rush to fund AI solutions in social development. And it's coming from, large tech at the end of the day. So keeping that in mind, we need to understand how are we reporting on it and what is actually being asked for also really matters.
Yes, to both.
Wonderful.
It's extremely lopsided, the funding situation, right? Like the amount of funding available for startups to deploy solutions, to build solutions, and the amount of funding available for evaluations. Like that's
Okay. On that note, on that serious note, let's go to some of the questions in the chat. Some interesting questions have come up. I think one of the first questions that came up was for you, Urvashi, about can you share a theory of change for the ASHA model that you have in terms of outcomes? But I think I would attach a broader question to it, that does having a theory of change for a AI solution if you have one, has it been helpful, or have you had to pivot even thinking of the theory of change when it comes to a AI solution?
So, I mean, I think having a theory of change for I think any program or any solution is a great idea because, like we were talking about earlier, right? Like it helps articulate what we think are the objectives and then kind of go back and test, right? Whether that really happened or manifested or not. So we do have a theory of change here. Some of the aspects of it might look different. Some of the assumptions might be different, right? So if I take the Asha bot example, I think when we went about designing it, one of the key assumptions was that like Asha workers would trust the responses from this bot, right? To like actually be using it consistently. They told us they had a problem that could be solved in terms of getting responses to their queries on time. But like, are they actually going to trust this bot that is giving them the answer? And one of the interesting things we heard was that when we were sort of onboarding them, because it came from like Khushi Baby sort of trainings that where they were onboarded, they thought this was like just somebody from Khushi Baby was answering these questions, right? Like not an AI solution. So that has a element of trust, but like then is that the best idea, right? Like you want them to know what is the solution, like what is this technology that's giving them these answers. So I think this quick wrap up of that would be we should definitely have theories of change. I think very deeply about the kind of assumptions that are involved when you are bringing this sort of new technology into this space.
Thank you, Urvashi. There is a question around mental health chatbots and the logics and the training data they are built on, and what does that training data not have? So if anyone would like to come in on if they have any experience or observations on if a gender audit or any evaluation has been happening of mental health chatbots. More of an open question to anyone who might have experience on this.
I don't have experience on this, but from the little that I have kind of some, discussions that I have attended, not much. I mean, this is like a very scary area. And if you kind of, intersect it with agency of, marginalized communities, it becomes really, really scary. Lots of people are pretty scared about this part.
And just to add, I also wouldn't boil it down to just training data. It's really looking at the very use case of somebody using a chatbot for mental health care, which really where we need to first figure out in what kind of supportive infrastructure are we really deploying along with the conversational agent. The conversational agent might be fantastic at understanding the context, at your anxieties, worries, etc., because it has scraped data from social media, it has scraped data from a lot of public forums. But at the end of the day, that little answer that it gives you or a very platitudinal essay it writes is not enough for really achieving the kind of mental health care gaps that we see, especially in the context of India, where a lot of the youngsters are struggling, a lot of the social care infrastructure is crippling apart. I think the question really begins from, is mental health chatbot the right use case for AI?
Well, and then that takes us back to the fundamental question where we started with, is AI the right solution, or are we falling in a techno-solutionism trap by not starting with that question? I think I'll pick up one last question from the chat about, again, this is a question for Arushi and Kalika, around while proprietary models have the possibility to be course corrected in terms of data sets, training, alignment with inputs of researchers like you, how do you think open weight models should be approached, given their nature of being once out, always out, and so they don't have that option to be to course correct more intentionally?
Maybe I can quickly come in here, and I would actually flip this in terms of that open weight, open source models are actually affording local organizations and civil society organizations to really fine-tune the model based on the socio-cultural context and really feed it the kind of values they want the model to parrot. There is, of course, a host of other issues in terms of the quality of open weight models, because there's a lot of funding for proprietary models, but we don't see that kind of funding and security infrastructure being devoted to open weight models. So there are those, of course, standing considerations, but purely from a safety perspective in terms of contextual relevance, in terms of how the model responds, open weight models give more agency, push more agency towards downstream, towards actors who have so far simply inheriting the risks and assumptions of foundation models. Open weight really kind of democratizes that and gives them the space to define those safety parameters.
And to add to that, and therefore those actors we have no control over. We can only kind of believe that they have good faith, and that is the only issue with open weight models. Because most big tech, their reputations, their income streams, etc., depend on things not going wrong. So there is a little bit more, effort on kind of securing these things and trying to address these problems. And, if you look at Yoshua Bengio's anything, like, his whole thing against open source models is this, that they are a huge security and safety threat. And there is no way to kind of, this is with these evolving, openly available, any system which can cause harm, that you have to keep, the regulation has to keep in step, it can do this now, then there's, some kind of governance mechanisms have to go a step, they will breach those, then they have to do something more. And governance doesn't only mean laws and, those things, but also technology to kind of get those right. So there is no easy answer for them, because this using open weight is like a balance between the pros and the cons.
Okay. With that, we are almost at time, and I don't think I can do justice summarizing what we have discussed and learned in this session. We have ranged from discussing real-world examples of evaluating AI solutions in deployment conditions and how important it is to take into account AI system maturity, what stage it is at, and so asking the right questions at that stage, to looking at AI models themselves. What values and contextual conditions can be used to create benchmarks for them, and what are the challenges with that? And I think both ends of this spectrum and everything in between is something that we as evaluators have to start looking more cohesively and concurrently, instead of looking at it in silos. This has been an amazing discussion. Thank you so much to the panelists, Kalika, Urvashi, Arushi, Nilakshi, and my colleagues at GXD, Deepthi and Vaidehi, for putting in such brilliant work, sharing with such openness both the learnings, the challenges, the reflections. I do hope we're able to keep this conversation going in some form or the other. This is a space we're still all actively learning in and building in. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.